So last class, we just started to discuss GDP, right? And we said there are three different approaches to study or to measure GDP, right? And what is GDP? So this slide summarizes what is GDP, right? So GDP is the market value or produce the goods and the service. It's 1, 2, and then within the country, 3, in a year, 4. Right? So this is GDP. And then so we have 3 approaches. Let's go back to that slide. Okay. So first we say, okay, so we can just categorize everyone into either households here or a firm. And then so we have 2 markets. One is a market for goods and service, the other is a market for factor. Right? And then, so how we measure the economic activity in this simple framework. So we say, okay, so households are going to purchase goods and service. Those are produced by the business. So in that sense, we can look at spending. But that spending must equal to what you produce. Right? So this is the one, this is another way to look at the economic activity. But then lastly, so anything you spend must have some income. Okay, this is 3. Okay. So they should they should equal to each other, right? And the one thing I mentioned also, the other thing, okay, so the one thing I want to highlight is, so the firm, their market value of the goods and service, they produce, eventually will show up as income or the payment to the factor they used. So that's why, so what you produce equal to the income for whoever owns the factor. All right? Okay. So this is how we calculate GDP, but certainly we add government, okay? And then so we add the rest of the world, okay, to complete the picture, right? Okay, make sure you understand that. But today, so we will have a simple question to help you to help you understand that. All right, so we have to go through those concepts. Yes, okay, so, and we also talk about the 3 different approaches, right? So I just summarized. So first, you look at what you produce, and then you look at what you spend. And finally, look at your income. Okay, so these 3 should equal to each other. Okay? Okay. Right. Okay, so now let me just elaborate a little bit or explain to you what we mean value added or what we mean final goods. Okay? So value added of a producer is the value of his sales, which is the market value of the goods and service, minus the value of his purchase of intermediate goods. How do you understand the intermediate goods? In this background picture, so this clothing or garment, so those final goods. So you sell them in the market, and then so you have a sales or you have a revenue. But in order to produce this garment, you need some intermediate goods or you need some input, right? But the actual process is more complicated than that, right? So you probably need more than this wool. Okay, so you need to just convert this wool into the clothing and the clothing into the other thing, right? But then the difference is called value added, or this is the value added for this particular business. But certainly, so this the farmer who raise those sheep, so they have their own value added. Okay. Now, in terms of the other approach with spending, okay. So the spending, so we need to look at the final goods and the service. Okay. So the final goods are goods and the service that sold to final or end user, like you and me. right? Like I explained to you last time. Okay? So the pen I use for my tablet is the final good. But before I purchase, so this pen may be ordered by, so this tablet maker through a third-party producer. Okay? But in that transaction, so this pen was used as a intermediate good, so not the final good. Or you can think about the CPU chips in your computer, right? So the computer maker, either you buy a MacBook, or you buy a Dell, or you purchase a Microsoft Surface. So whatever you have, you should then need the CPU chips. And then so they just purchase the CPU chips from either AMD or Intel or other company. So that's considered intermediate goods, right? So formally, so intermediate goods and service bought from one firm by another firm. So they are inputs for production of final goods and service. Right. And then in terms of the spending. So actually, so we can have this equation. What is this equation? This equation says GDP. By the way, so GDP here, we can understand the total spending of the economy. Right? And then so GDP or the total spending, we can characterize in 4 different sources. So this includes consumption, or consumer spending. So this is household spending, right? Like the regular things we purchase, or even including grocery. Second is investment spending. The investment spending, just think about the business purchasing machinery. The business invests in infrastructure, right? And furthermore, last class we also mentioned, so the business, they have a change in their inventory. Okay? So the change in inventory is also characterized as investment spending, right? And then so we have government purchase of goods and service, right? And then lastly, so we have X minus IM. So we usually put these together. So X minus IM. X is export. It's produced by us domestically, but then we sold to foreigner or consumed by foreigner. IM is produced by others, and then so consumed by us. So then so we need to look at the net term. So the net term is equal to the market value of goods we produced, but it flew out of our border. Okay, so this is called net export. And actually, this is how the actually data looks like. If we look at the GDP through this two approach we just learned, right? So one is by looking at value added. So this value added, some are created by business, some are created by households, and some are created by government, right? And on the other hand, so we can look at the expenditure approach. Okay, so this includes, see, the consumer spending, that's the biggest one. Okay, and then, so we have investment spending, and then government purchase. Lastly, we have net export. Okay. So these two you should add together and equal to the same number, right? Approach we just learned, right? So in this example, so the economy has 3 business, right? So they just to simplify. Okay. So the first business is American oil, right? And then the second business, the second biggest, American steel. Okay? And then finally, you have American Motor. So there are three businesses, right? And then for each business, we can look at value of the sales as their revenue. And then so for each business, you can look at what intermediate good they use. And finally, you can look at, so what is the cost of production? All right. And then so we can look at three approaches. Approach number one. So we can look at value of production, but this is production of final goods. Now let's go one by one. The first business, okay? American ore. So they produce ore, but what are the intermediate goods they use? Zero. So essentially they just extract the minerals, okay? Or the raw materials from the nature. And then, so that's come with no cost because it's just extracted from the natural, not manufactured, right? So intermediate goods is zero. Hence, we can easily find out their value added is 4,200, right? Now we can look at the second business. Right? The second business, they produce steels, 9,000. But then, so they use all, look at here. So that's the connection. All right. So the ore, so what they produce goes to the production of steel. So hence you have 4,800. So they come from what? Come from this 9,000. Subtract 4,200, right? Okay, so we could do the same things, American Motor. So now this $9,000 of steel goes to the production of cars. And similarly, so we end up with 12,500. So this is value added. Now we add them together. So just we add these together. We are going to get the first number, right? Okay. So now the second approach, we can look at aggregate spending. Okay. But this one is just very simple. So the only spending we have is the car people purchased, right? Because these things doesn't go to the customers. Only the car goes to final customer, right? So hence, so the car, the value of the car is the total expenditure, the second approach. Now we go to the third approach, which is the total payment, which is essentially income. Right? And then how we do that? So look at wage, so that's income to labor, interest, income to capital, rent, that's income to building, and profit, that is after we pay wage, interest, rent, okay? And then so essentially this is what we pay to the ownership or the owners, shareholders, right? And then we add those numbers together, we get the total wage of this number. Similarly, and we add all interest payment together, we get 2,600, so on and so forth. And we add these four numbers, we're going to get 21,500. All right? So those are three different approaches and give us the same number. Okay. Now let's look at other examples. So now we have this flow chart diagram. Okay. But here, so I'm going to explain to you two approaches. Okay. What are the two approaches? So I'm going to explain to you the expenditure approach. Basically, look at here. And I'm going to explain to you the income approach. All right, let's go one by one. So in order to use the expenditure approach, so the key things is what? The key things is we need to identify the four sources of expenditure, right? So this includes C, include C. Sorry. And then so include C, right? What else include? It also includes the I, right? So by the way, here C is 700, right? So the I is 120, right? So 120. So, and then next one is G, government spending, right? So government spending is 200. And then finally, we have net export. So what is net export? So net export here is, so this is going to be 30 minus 50, right? So end up with net export equal to negative 20. So now we add everything together, right? So again, so consumption C equal to 70, and investment equal to 120. And then so government spending equal to here 20. And finally, so net export equal to 30 minus 50 equal to negative 20. We add them together, so that equal to 1,000. Okay. Now we go to other side. So we look at income. Then the income, so the only things we have here is this number, right? So the total income, the wage, profit, interest, rent. So means if we look at income, we get the same number. Okay. Very good. Okay, so now we look at another example. Okay? So this is a very simple economy. In this economy, we have four business, sorry. Okay. And then we have information on rent, wage, sales tax, and rent. Okay. And then so here, so I want to emphasize how we are going to calculate via income approach. Okay. So, and then so the income, so what we have? The income we have, so including profit, including wage, including rent. And then the typical mistake student made from our previous semester is that, so some students include the sales tax. And then they argue, so sales tax is income for government. Now, the problem is if you consider sales tax as the income of government, and then, so you must subtract from the profit or whatever. Otherwise, you have double accounting. Okay, so that's it. That's the only thing I want to emphasize. Okay. All right, so another practice question. Okay, so this is like a learning by doing so that we understand these things. Suppose the country A sell 1 million goods to B, and the country B sell 50 million to A. Now the question asks, is 150. The question asks net export in country A or B. Right? So we start with A. So A has net export of 100 minus 50. Right? That just gives you 50. Because there are only two countries. So if A has net export, it must means B has net import, or so the net export must equal to negative 50. Okay? Or in other words, this is correct. Okay. So the answer is A. Okay. Now, I believe this is the last one. Income spent on imported goods. A represents income that has leaked across national border. This is correct. B must be subtracted from spending data to calculate an accurate value for domestic production. Yes, it's also correct. C is income that is not spent in domestic produced goods and services. So A, B, and C, they are all correct. Right? So that's how we understand export and import. All right. So this slide just explains to you the history of NIPA account, National Income and Product account, right? So I leave that for you to read. So that's just a brief history. All right. So now we move to the second part of this chapter. Okay. So we are going to differentiate between real GDP and the nominal GDP. And furthermore, we are going to study price index. Right. So, but what is the real GDP? What is the nominal GDP? So the difference is, so they use different price. So real GDP, so start with the nominal GDP. Nominal GDP, we calculate the market value of goods and services, use the price in current period. But real GDP, we use the price of a selected base year. Okay, let me highlight. So the difference is here. Okay, so nominal GDP use price in the current. Real GDP use price of a selected base year. Okay. Now I can give you examples to help you to understand. Right. So in this example, so we have a simple economy. So this economy, they only produce two things, right? So we can see it from here. Okay. So they produce apple or orange. And we have two different years or two different time period, year one versus year two, right? And then so here, so we have quantity. So this is quantity, right? Versus the quantity here. And then what is nominal GDP? So nominal GDP essentially is just ask you, so if we look at the year one, and then ask you, so what is the market value of 2,000 apple and 1,000 orange they produced? And then so in order to calculate nominal GDP, we use the quantity here, apply the price here. Quantity here, we apply the price here. And then we can do the same thing for year two. Quantity here, price here. Quantity here, price here. But what is real GDP? So real GDP is different. Okay, real GDP. So let's say, for example, so we want to look at year two's real GDP. Then the first thing we need to do is pick the price. Now, so for example, we use year one's price. And then, so we are going to use the quantity here, multiply the price here. Quantity here, multiply the price here. All right. And then you may be wondering, so why would it do that? This is because just imagine there's an economy. Okay. So instead of apple production in apple increase, like we saw here, or orange increase, let's just say, okay, so this economy, or you can just create year three, the third year. Okay, the third year you have the same quantity, but the price is like here. Okay, just think about in that situation. Now, if we look at the nominal GDP, what are we going to see? You're going to see, so these economies have some growth, but there's nothing changing in terms of what they produce, right? As I just constructed the example. So they produce 2,000 orange apples, 1,000 orange. Nothing changed. The only thing changes is the price, right? So in other words, so if we look at the nominal GDP, and then so the increase or change in your GDP partially come from price change, but the price or the change in price doesn't bring us any real value. So that's why we want to look at real GDP. Okay, and to finish this part, so you can find out the real GDP here in this example. Okay? But again, how we calculate this real GDP? Use the quantity here, quantity times the price. But here we use year one. So here we use year one as base year. Quantity times price, quantity times price. And the same for year two. So quantity times this price, quantity times this price. All right. So now let's look at an example. Okay, learning by doing. Read this table. Question asks, what is the nominal GDP in 2011? All right. So the way we finish this problem is we calculate the nominal GDP in 3 different years because he asked to compare the nominal GDP in 2011 with 2010 and then 2012. Right? Okay. So how we calculate nominal GDP? Just follow the explanation we had in the previous slide. So for example, 2011, the nominal GDP is 5 times price here, 80 times price here. All right. So now if we look at 2012, quantity times price here, 100 times price here. And lastly, 2010, quantity times price here, quantity times price here. Okay, so this is how we calculate nominal GDP. Once we calculate nominal GDP, and then so we can compare which one has larger nominal GDP. All right. So here the answer is D. Now we go to the next one, the same table, but ask you different questions. Okay. So in these questions, they ask you, what is the real GDP in 2011? Now the base year is used as 2010. Well, in other words, so here just ask you, so what is the value of the goods and services we produce here, which is 5 and 80? Evaluate the price of 2010. And then in order to calculate the real GDP, we use this 5 times price here. We use 80 times price here. All right. And then so we can compute the other year. Okay, so for example, if you want to calculate the real GDP in 2012, and then we use 5 times this 10,000, use 100 times this 10. Okay, so this is how we calculate the real GDP for different year. But this question asks you, if we compare the real GDP in 2010 versus nominal GDP in real GDP in 2011, real GDP in 2011 versus nominal GDP in 2011. Okay, so we just learned how to calculate real GDP. Okay, so we can do the same exercise for nominal GDP. What's nominal GDP? So nominal GDP is going to be 5 times this price, 80 times this price. Right? And then so we can compare. But certainly because the price increased and the price increased, and the certainty the nominal GDP will be bigger than real GDP in this example. Okay. All right. So now we look at the same example. But now, so this question asks you comparing real GDP in 3 years. right? But here, so now 2011 was used as base year. So let's go one by one. For 2010, the real GDP will be this number multiplied by this number. 100 multiplied by this number. So this 2010's real GDP. For 2011, so this divided times this, and use this one times this one. This 2011. Now finally, 2012, use 5 times this, 100 times this. All right, so this is how we calculate the real GDP for each year. Once we calculate the real GDP, we can compare which one has highest number. All right, so the answer is D. Okay. Now, this slide just show you what the actual nominal and real GDP looks like in the United States. So I want to ask you a question. If we look at this table, can you tell me which year has been used as base year? So the answer is 2009. Why? It's because from this table, we find 2009 nominal GDP equal to real GDP. Okay, so that just means, so you use the same price for nominal or real. So that just means, okay, so 2009 is the year we use base year, right? Okay. So usually nominal GDP and real GDP are different. Okay, more than that, so we are going to have a more complicated problem. Now let's just back to this example to highlight the issue. Right. So if we want to find out the economic growth or how things change from 2010 to 2011, usually we look at real GDP. Why we look at a real GDP is because otherwise, so you may inflate because there's a price change, right? But now, so when we look at a real GDP, so in this example, so we can use 2010 as the base year, or we can use 2011 as base year, right? So what that means is, so you can calculate the real GDP by use 5 times this number, 100 times this number, and 5 times this number, and 80 times this number. All right, and then so you calculate the change in output. But alternatively, we can do the other way. So let's use different color. So you can use 5 times this number and 100 times this number. You can use 5 times this number and 80 times this number. Now the problem is usually, so you're going to get different growth in terms of GDP. Okay, so depending on which year you use as base year. And then if we are in that situation, how we are going to report the growth number? Right. So the answer is, so we are going to use a chain weighted rule. So in other words, we just look at average. So you can start use this year as base year, and then so we calculate the GDP growth. And then next we use this year as base year, calculate the GDP growth, and then they take the average. All right. So this is summarized by this part. So chain dollar. The method of calculating change in real GDP using the average between the growth rate calculated on an early base year and the growth rate calculated on a later base year. Or in other words, we just calculate the growth, use different year as base year, and then take the average. Right. And then lastly, so GDP is good and important indicator for our economy. And usually we look at per capita GDP. So it's because the total GDP, so you have population. Right? So per capita GDP is a more meaningful measure for standard of living. But even though it is a good indicator for the standard of living, but it's not a perfect. Like this diagram shows. Okay. So what we have here? Okay. So we have GDP per capita on the horizontal line. And then we have percentage of population reporting thriving on the vertical line. And this vertical line, so essentially we can interpret it as the happiness index, right? Now, we have so many countries. Yes, on average, or if you look at the bigger trend, so there is a positive correlation, right? So there's just a different color to highlight. So there's a positive trend, right? Okay. But now we have some outliers. So for example, Israel. So their index of happiness very high, right? And it's higher than United States, but their income is much lower. Or in other words, okay, so lower per capita GDP doesn't necessarily means you're less happier. Okay. Now, if we look at other example, Japan. So their income is very high, but so in terms of happiness index, it's very low, right? On the other hand, so you have high income doesn't necessarily means you're bringing happiness to your people, right? So overall, it is true, there's a positive correlation, but this data can be noisy, right? Or in other words, so we cannot just purely pursue higher GDP per capita because there are other dimensions of our economy, so that matters, right? And these slides just emphasize or re-emphasize or highlight the importance of real GDP versus nominal GDP. If we look at Venezuela, so if we look at the nominal GDP, so you can see the growth was spectacular. But if we look at real GDP, you can see it's very modest. But what's the difference between these two? Largely because of price change, right? And this also the highlight, so it's better to look at real GDP. Okay. Otherwise, you are going to have a distorted view. Okay. Now we look at aggregate price. Okay. What is aggregate price level? So this is a measure of the overall level price in the economy. It's not about one particular goods and service. It's about the overall price, but how we can measure overall price. And then so we need to define overall. The way we define overall is just define a market basket. So this is a hypothetical set of consumer purchase of goods and service, right? So say for example, when we compute the consumer price index, and then so we are going to create a hypothetical basket. So inside this basket, there are many goods and services, but those are goods and services consumed by typical American households. So this is going to include housing, transportation, education, food and beverage, clothing, okay, so on and so forth. All right. Now let's use an example to explain how we compute the price index. So we have a simple economy. So in this economy, so they only consume 3 goods. Okay, so it's include orange, grapefruits, and a lemon. We want to understand the price change for overall economy. And then so we are going to define a basket. But then here, so what does the basket look like? So the basket, so here, so the basket is going to be 200 orange. Sorry, I lose my pointer again. Yeah, so the basket includes 200 orange, 50 grapefruits, and 100 lemon. And then, so what is price index? We just look at the cost of this basket over time, right? Let's say, for example, so there are two time periods. One is pre-frost, the other post-frost. And then, so in order to calculate price index, we use 200 times this price, 50 times this price, and 100 times this price. Okay, this first step. Now, similarly, for the post-frost, we can do the same things, right? So post-frost, we use this 200. Oh, sorry. So for post-frost, we use this 200 here, times price here, 50 times price here, and 100 times price here. Okay. Now we can find out the cost of this basket at the two different time periods. Okay, end up with 95 versus 175. This first step. Next step. So we are going to use this formula to find out price index. So this is the cost of market basket in a given year. So that's the year you are interested in, divided by the cost of market basket in this year. So that's the year we use as a benchmark. So in the previous example, so if we want to look at the price index of pre-frost, we use pre-frost as baseline. And then that's straightforward. Use 95 divided by 95 times 100. You 100. Now, if you're interested in what's the price index in post-frost, then I'll use 175 divided by 95 times 100. All right. So we end up with something close to 200. Okay. So now let's look at examples to understand what we just learned. Okay. So in this example, so we have 3 goods people are going to consume: orange, apple, and banana. Right? And furthermore, the market basket consists 200 orange, 100 apple, 100 banana. Now, the question asks you, what is price index in 2011? If 2011 is used as base year. But actually, we don't need to do any calculation. This is by construction. This must be equal to 100. Right? Because it's a base year. It uses the same price. Okay? For both numerator and denominator. Right? So now we go to the next one. So the table is the same, the information is the same. So now I'll ask you what's the value of price index in 2012. Okay. And then, so we need to find out the cost of the basket, right? So that just means, so we use 200 times this one, and 100 times this number, and another 100 times this number. And then, so we are going to get the cost of the basket in 2012. All right, next step. So we use this 200 times this number, 100 times this number, and 100 times this number. And we are going to get the cost of the basket in 2011. Now we use the first number divided by the second number times 100. Okay, and the end of its answer is 103. Right. So now, given the price index, we can calculate inflation. Okay. But what is inflation rate? So inflation rate essentially is a change in price index. But in reality, we have different price index. The most commonly used price index is the consumer price index. And the inflation rate usually is based on consumer price index. But what is consumer price index? So essentially, consumer price index has a particular market basket. Okay? And then, so this particular market basket is what a typical American family will consume. All right. Let me show you what the basket looks like. And then we return to the previous slide. So this is the makeup of the consumer price index in 2010, or in other words, so this is what included in the market basket that is used to compute the consumer price index. Right. So I want to highlight, so this market basket may look different from your family. All right, or even may differ from any family you are familiar with. But just remember, so this is a typical American family, means we are going to with different background. Right? So this basket we see here, okay, is represent American family coming from different race, different ethnicity, different income, different education, different geographic location. Right? So you cannot expect, so this is exactly like your family, right? Because this is a hypothetical, this is a composite, right? But I would say so probably it's going to similar to yours, right? Anyway, now back to here. So once we keep track of the cost of this market basket for a typical American household, we first create consumer price index. And then so from this consumer price index, we get inflation rate. But this inflation rate essentially is the percentage change in price index. All right. So we can look at the example. So this is the same table we used for previous questions. So this one asks you, what is the rate of inflation between 2011 and 2012? So just remind you, 2011, the price index is 100. Okay, let me write down. So 2011 price index is 100. Okay. 2012, the price index is 103. That's what we compute. And then, so what's the inflation? So essentially is a percentage change from 100 to 103. Right? So that's percentage change. And obviously the answer is B, right? 3%. Okay. Now, you may be wondering, how does the CPI change over time? So this is how it looks for US economy. Overall, it's increasing, but there's fluctuation. And typically, so look at here, this is declining. right? So this during the Great Depression, right? And usually the price index will fall when economy is in a slump. The price index will increase when the economy is in expansion. Okay, but over the long term, so the price index will be independent to the economy. It will be largely determined by money supply. So we will discuss that in later chapter, right? So besides consumer price index, we also have producers price index. The difference is the market basket. Okay? So like I show you, so let's go back to the previous slide. So this is a market basket for consumer. Now we are going to do the same things for producer. So basically we're going to survey different business. And then to find out what do they typically consume. And then keep track of that, the price of that market basket. To highlight the difference. So for example, so the typical households don't consume raw material like lumber, like oil, like copper, right? So but those are the typical things consumed by business for their manufacturing, for the business. On the other hand, so the typical business don't spend on education, right? But that's what the typical household spend. So they have different goods to consume, and then so we are going to create different index. Okay, so that's how we calculate the producer price index. So consumer price index is used to measuring the cost of living, and the producer's price index is used to measuring the cost of production. And finally, we can also look at a GDP deflator. But what is a GDP deflator? The simplest way to understand it is that, okay, so we are going to define everything we produced at the market basket. Okay. So to summarize, so there are three price index. Okay, so their difference lies into how we define the market basket. Consumer price index will focus on typical American households consume. Producers price index will pay attention to typical business consume. And the GDP deflator is the most comprehensive. We just put everything inside, whatever we produce in that year, right? So this is GDP deflator. So, but essentially, so GDP deflator is going to be the ratio of nominal GDP versus real GDP, right? And so this is how those three numbers may look like in reality. Okay? So what do we learn from this picture? So they are tracking with each other because usually, so they reflect the price change. But now you're going to see the one is more volatile than the other. The GDP deflator is less volatile. How we understand this less volatile? So for example, there's an increase. There's increase here, right? And you can see, so this line, this purple line is GDP deflator, increase the least. But the producer's price index increase the most. Why? It's because GDP deflator, we have a bigger market basket. So if there's a price change, it's going to relatively stable. But then you may be wondering why producer price index is more volatile than consumer price index. This is because so consumer, so most of the things they consume is less elastic. Just imagine if there's a price change, to what extent you can change your consumption of food and beverage. But for business, so if there is a price change, so they can change their consumption behavior. say for example, they can postpone their investment. But there's less wiggle room for consumer. So that explains why producer price index is more volatile than consumer price index. That also explains why usually the newspapers or the central bank, they pay more attention to consumer price index than producer price index. All right. All right, to finish this part, let me show you this video, right? So the point of this video is just highlight the importance of GDP, but there's something go beyond to GDP, right? Oh, it seems not very good. All right, so this is not available here. So let me